I would like to welcome you to the Rocks lecture series from Lake Mývatn on this beautiful summer's day. But the lake and its vicinity are one of the sites of research in the Rocks project. But from Lake Mývatn, we will travel across the North Atlantic to Oslo, where we find our speaker today, Bergsveinn Þórsson. But he is going to talk to us about assembling Anthropocenes, museums communication and climate action. So just a short introduction. Bergsveinn is a postdoctoral fellow affiliated with the Co-Futures Research Group at the University of Oslo. He holds a doctoral degree in museology and has specialized in cultural institutions' role in promoting climate action and sustainable futures. We are so delighted to have him with us today. So now, Bergsveinn, again, I'm incredibly happy to have you with us today, and a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I would like to give the virtual floor to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Artis, and thank you for the invitation to present in this forum. I'm just going to share my screen, put on some slides here. Right, so yes, as Artis mentioned, my name is Bergsveinn Þórsson and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo. And what I'm going to talk about today is based on my doctoral thesis, which I delivered in 2019. But I'm still kind of, it's material I'm still highly engaged with and still working on. The title of the talk comes from the thesis, Assembling Anthropocenes, and I'm going to go through some of the material, particularly material I gathered from a research visit at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the US. And I'm going to talk about, well, Anthropocene and how that concept has been used or mobilized in order to sort of tackle or deal with environmental issues. I'm going to start with a short quote, which is, I'm sorry, it's in Icelandic, but I'll quickly translate it for you. It is a quote from a book that's called On Time and Water by Andri Snær Magnússon, an Icelandic author, a lovely book about sort of a personal journey through sort of engagement with the climate crisis. And in this quote, he says, the changes we face are more complex than most of what our mind is used to tackle. They are bigger than all previous experiences, surpassing our language and metaphors we use to make sense of reality. Here, of course, he's referring to the climate crisis, and I think it's an appropriate starting point for my talk, because the way I approached the Anthropocene, and particularly the way museums are mobilizing the concept, is very much connected to climate change and sort of this problem, if we can call it, that Andri Snær manages to describe so well, the problem of how can we actually grasp this very complex phenomena that climate change and the implications of climate change are. So in one way, the Anthropocene became very popular and is still sort of a very sort of highly discussed and debated concept. I believe strictly related to climate change and sort of like, these questions about how can we talk about climate change and more kind of like wider questions about human impact on the planet. The Anthropocene originates as a geological concept. It was popularized by Paul Crutzen in 2001, and proposed as a potential geological epoch for the geological timescale. Still today, the concept is not an official part of the International Chronostratigraphic Chart. They have a working group that is sort of looking into the potentials or possibilities of making it an official part of the geological timescale, but they haven't sort of made it official yet. Still, since 2001, it has become very sort of popular term and very quickly moved beyond geology and into other disciplines. And I think particularly because of historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, when he wrote in 2008 a paper that was kind of looking into what are the implications of combining or thinking together geological timescale and sort of human historical scale. What impact does that have on historicity and how we sort of, write human history and Earth history? Here's just a small sample of the publications that are dealing with this concept, and I think it's very interesting to see that sort of the very enthusiastic discussions and debates are still ongoing and have kind of moved away from geology and more kind of into social sciences, humanities, and also the cultural sector. So in some way it has been, kind of taken over, but still it has this connection to geology. But in many instances, it doesn't necessarily strictly sort of deals with Anthropocene as a geological concept. Sometimes it becomes more kind of a phrase to sort of describe or a way to grasp the wide implications of human impact on the planet, and climate change, pollution, resource extraction, and so forth. Quickly, sort of through this discussion, museums and cultural institutions picked up on this concept, and here is a sort of just a small sample of different exhibitions that have been dealing with this concept. You have both exhibitions in art museums, in natural history museums, and cultural history museums. So it's kind of like crossing these different types of museums, because in essence, it deals a lot with sort of the interconnectedness of nature and culture, and sort of the problem we are facing with when we talk about human impact on the planet, climate change, and sort of this idea that the human population on the planet is making a stronger impact than these kind of more well-known geological forces. So this really implies sort of a break away from this nature-culture binary. Museums are for me, as a museologist, of course, a very interesting subject of investigation or an object. And I think here it is mainly because museums, they are sort of on the intersection of sort of academic work of natural sciences, of human sciences, humanities, and social sciences, and sort of the public, if you could sort of phrase it quite simply. They are dealing with sort of like ways how to communicate and how to engage communities and sort of communicate the knowledge that is sort of created within scientific fields. But of course, through this process, museums themselves, they are also contributors to these knowledge productions, and they are far from being neutral pathways of transferring knowledge from experts to the novice or to the public. So it's a very sort of, especially dealing with this challenge or this problem that Anders phrased. How can we grasp this phenomenon that is immensely complex and has these wide implications that it feels like nothing is disconnected from the climate crisis. So museums really have to kind of figure out ways to grasp that. And in one of the sort of cases I looked at in my doctoral research was the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And I was really interested in what they were doing, especially because it was not only about making a temporary exhibition on the Anthropocene, it was also sort of taken in as a concept to impact all the work that is taking place within the institution, not only communication, exhibition or museum learning, but also the research that is taking place at the museum and all sort of different aspects of museum work. So I traveled there and sort of did this kind of very short-term ethnographic field work, where I was talking to different experts and scientists at the museum, and also marketing people, exhibition makers, curators, people in the education department. And I was trying to kind of make sense of how this concept, the Anthropocene, how it is constructed or assembled. I was influenced by sort of assemblage theory, that is this kind of analytical tool to tackle social complexity, and sort of as a way to gather together these different actors or different sources that come together to create this concept, to translate it from this kind of abstract sense of an idea or a phrase into an exhibition or into action or material. So I spent a lot of time at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and I was walking around, taking pictures, talking to people, sitting down, thinking, and doing all these sort of what seemed to be very mundane things. But I came across very sort of fascinating material, especially because there were so many different ideas going on. There were different opinions and different kind of expertise that came together, and especially in a temporary exhibition they made, which was called We Are Nature, Living in the Anthropocene. And this happened, took place in 2018. And I was there a month or two after they opened the exhibition. And the exhibition was seen as a sort of a starting point for this adventure, if you can call it, which was kind of led by the museum director, Eric Dorfman, because he was very enthusiastic about the potentials of this concept, as I described earlier, not only as a way to communicate climate change and sort of the impact of human activity on the planet, but also sort of a term that could bring together different disciplines from biology to geology and communication. The exhibition itself was very interesting because it drew together different ideas that were brewing inside the museum. I remember particularly when I was talking to people from the communication department that they saw the Anthropocene as an interesting way to actually approach questions of climate change, because in the States it has been sort of politicized quite a lot. So they saw it as a sort of a backdoor entrance into talking to people about climate change. And they also cited studies, visitor studies they have done, which showed that around 25% of their visitors were sort of climate skeptics. So this was an important tool for them to start a discussion that would lead into discussions about climate change. The exhibition itself was divided into 3 sections, and it started with this kind of an introduction where they were answering these questions: what is the Anthropocene? And there you had this very kind of, usual description or explanation that it is a geological concept. But when you entered the second part of the exhibition, which was kind of what they called the evidence of the Anthropocene, a wide selection of objects mostly that revealed the human impact on the planet, it stopped being strictly geological, and you kind of had this feeling that it was more about biology or ecology than geology. And I found it very interesting because for me, it was a clear sign of how this concept has how it is flexible in that terms, because even though it has this strong connection to the this debate about whether it is a geological epoch or not, it can very easily move towards being a concept that deals with environmental issues or human impact in general. In the exhibition, you saw a wide selection of objects, not only from the museum's collection, you also saw objects that were on loan from other organizations, objects that were created for the exhibition, like the shopping cart you can see in the right corner, lower corner. Well, an object that was made to be sort of authentic, something that they fished up from the river, a shopping cart, but actually the truth is that they had to recreate the object because it started to smell quite badly as soon as you fished it out of the water. The goat in the middle is on loan from another institution or a center that is also located in Pittsburgh. It is called the Center of Post-Natural History. It is an artist-led center that is dealing with what is called the post-natural, focusing on how humans have deliberately altered all kinds of organisms. So this goat is called Freckles, the biosteel goat, and it's actually genetically altered to produce silk proteins in its milk that was used to produce silk. And this collaboration between Richard Pell, who is the artist who runs the Center for Post-Natural History, and the Carnegie Museum of Natural History is quite interesting, because Richard Pell started his endeavor investigating natural history museums and created the center when he realized that natural history museums usually didn't look into sort of these organisms that have been intentionally altered by humans. And he mentioned the chicken as a great example, because in the Anthropocene, you have chicken being sort of one of the most, well, I think it's probably has the biggest population of an animal, living animal outside the humans on the planet, but you don't really find specimens of in natural history museums. So I think this is a very interesting sort of collaboration, and in some sense, an acknowledgement by the museum that this is an important sort of aspect of the Anthropocene that they need to bring into the museum, filling these kinds of gaps that are possibly the result of sort of this kind of nature culture binary, where you have questions about where does this line, where is the line between nature and culture, especially when you're looking at animals or organisms that have been intentionally altered. Are they not pure enough anymore to be considered part of this nature category? But yet again, a good example of how this sort of categorization is kind of a bit more messy than sometimes we want to believe. Other sort of initiatives and projects, not only outside the museum, but within as well, had a huge influence on this exhibition. The picture to the right is the one of the Lego buildings, is from a project the Museum Education Department developed and participated in, called Climate Urban System Partnerships, and it's basically about climate communication, and where they were figuring out ways to reach out to the local communities. And this project created this kind of almost a manifesto, or sort of this theoretical approach to their engagement, which emphasized on sort of finding a frame of relevance to approach people. So it kind of started the climate communication from a local perspective, starting the discussion by referring to something that the local population cared about or was worried about. And this particular thing that they developed was Lego buildings, and you had sponges and a little bit of water. And this was a way for them to engage and approach families, talk about increased raining and the impact on sort of the urban infrastructure or the urban systems that you have to kind of adapt to sort of increased rain. So here we have like two examples of different sort of ideas or different projects that came together under this umbrella of the Anthropocene. And in the sort of lower left corner, there are two specimens of plants that were collected 100 years apart. Part of a project the museum is also working on within botany, where they are revisiting sites where specimens have been collected 100 years ago, and sort of collecting specimens today of the same type and comparing them to actually see how climate change is affecting the life cycle of organisms. A very fascinating project, and part of a larger network that stretches across the world, where they are building up a sort of larger database of these kind of historical revisits So in this particular case, at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the museum as an institution, as a unit, is kind of assembling or putting together different objects, different kind of knowledge, bringing together different types of people, artists, botanists, biologists, and geologists, and sort of creating their own particular version, if you call it, of the Anthropocene that is sort of a kind of situated or specific to their own location, both in terms of connection to localities, to the local community, but at the same time has this kind of like global reach through research projects, as for example, the historical recollection. In addition to this, what I was looking at, I went through sort of the strategic plan of the museum and had dialogues with the director and some of the scientists working there, the education department. And it was really interesting to kind of hear how they all kind of differently engaged with this concept and had different kind of ideas. So what I wanted to kind of take away from this and kind of highlight is sort of the situatedness of the Anthropocene, that even though this is a term that is meant to kind of embrace all the complexities of human impact on the planet, it has a particular sort of materialization depending on where it is. And I found this also quite interesting as I was, walking around the museum, that even though you have these very, many different people coming together, people's things and all of that, there were still some aspects of the Anthropocene sort of discourse that weren't necessarily part of this assemblage of the Anthropocene in the museum. For example, part of the museum and sort of the history of the museum is obviously connected to industry, and you could see in the grand staircase, which is sort of in the middle of the museum, this homage to industry and progress and industrialization. It wasn't really addressed in the exhibition, but many of the people I talked to, they were kind of aware of this connection, and particularly with the Anthropocene, because when Paul Crutzen sort of wrote his short text about the Anthropocene in 2001, he mentioned the industrialization specifically as a potential sort of starting point of this geological epoch, and citing to James Watt's invention of the steam engine as a potential sort of like very specific starting point. So here you can see this kind of like putting this sort of a history of the city on a pedestal that wasn't really part of this assemblage, but still maybe because you have this in the museum. So it was very interesting to see how some elements of the concept became very clear. For example, the sort of nature-culture binary, while other, for example, this kind of like historical context wasn't. And other things, I wanted to just bring up this quote from this article, which is called "The Anthropocene in Natural History Museums: A Productive Lens of Engagement." It's a short article written by some of the people from the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, but also others who had been sort of engaging with the Anthropocene in exhibition work. And here they are kind of like dealing with another type or another absence in their engagement, and that is questions of climate justice and social inequity. Because the two exhibitions they wrote about, one of them being the We Are Nature exhibition at the Carnegie Museum, they acknowledged that the museum dealt very lightly with the politics of the Anthropocene, and kind of justified that sort of through arguing that this is something that natural history museums haven't really dealt with and are taking sort of the appropriate steps towards collaborating more with social scientists and humanists, while also sharing science, which I thought was quite interesting, because even though you have the Anthropocene as a concept breaking up these kind of like nature culture barriers, they are still also reinforcing them by acknowledging like we have to establish collaboration with other fields that are maybe not as strictly scientific as natural sciences, but still important. So this kind of led me through sort of, well, since 2018, I've been thinking a lot about sort of like, what is the, what does this concept, the Anthropocene, actually afford? What are the mechanisms behind these sort of concepts, and particularly these kind of like grand, big ideas, complex things. And I was very interested in this particular thing as well, because you have increasing pressure on sort of thinking about climate change as a sort of a justice issue that, because you have the impact of climate change is well, it impacts populations that are actually contributing the least to the problem, and that this kind of depoliticization of climate change is a problem because it ignores sort of the realities of social injustice and inequity. And I think the same applies to the Anthropocene, for example, and sort of how it, well, very easily goes into this mode about looking at the impact on the planet as a species thing, that this is human impact. But maybe it isn't human, maybe it's more Western impact, or maybe it is not all humans. Or so I think that's a really important aspect of the debate or the discussions surrounding the Anthropocene, and these questions about when should this geological epoch begin. And as I mentioned, that Paul Crutzen, he proposed the industrial revolution as a starting point, which is quite an sort of Europe-centric perspective, and which I think can also sort of frame the discussion or the definition of the concept maybe not totally correctly. Another suggestion was made that it should start in the 1610 with the sort of transatlantic slave trade, and sort of how when Europeans settled in the Americas and started to have sort of very serious impact on the local population, the indigenous people, and started transforming the geography of the American continent. So these are sort of all very sort of relevant and important issues that need to be addressed when thinking about the Anthropocene. And I think what we can take away from this particular case is that even though these are grand ideas, grand concepts that are sort of supposed to cover the whole sort of planet, we have to be aware of not normalizing it, and that maybe it can be used as a tool of critique, and in similar fashion with climate change, that there is a political historical side of the coin that needs to be addressed as well. I think I'll stop now. I've been talking for more than half an hour, but I could talk forever. I'll just stop now.
So thank you very much, Bergsveinn, for this very interesting talk.